Our study today is the abomination of desolation, which in these last days is a very important subject for us to be considering. The abomination of desolation. And what do you see on the screen? Rome, the Vatican, exactly right. This is what they call St. Peter's Square. They don't know a lot about geometry, do they? But it's round, and why is it round? Because it is an ancient sun wheel that is being pictured there. And what's in the middle of the sun wheel? An obelisk, which was imported from a pagan source, okay? And that's where really all of the statues and all of the things, they're imported from ancient paganism, and they're given new names. What Joe Cruz used to say, Christianized, right? Baptized paganism is another way that we put it. But anyway, this is the Vatican. And the abomination of desolation, what does it have to do with that? Everything. Everything is the answer. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna talk about this abomination of desolation. As we get started, a statement from Ellen White. She said in Battle Creek Letters, page 111, "At times, with burning earnestness and words of terrible severity, Christ denounced the abominations that he saw in the church and in the world. He would not allow the people to be deceived by false claims to righteousness and sanctity." You know, that picture we were just looking at, first and foremost, is a church. Right? And we go through life sometimes, and, you know, we used to say fat, dumb, and lazy. We go through life and we think, well, it's a church, then it's good. Churches can't be bad. Churches can't be wrong. All these kind of ideas. But in fact, she says false claims to righteousness and sanctity. And she says that Jesus would not allow the people to be deceived by those things. In Jesus' day, the church, the Jewish church, was looked on it as the most righteous people in the world, right? It was God's true church, and that's what those people in that church claim. But we need to be willing to stand up for the truth and to call sin by its right name so that we're more like Jesus and we're not going to allow the people to be deceived by false claims of righteousness and sanctity. Amen? So that's what we want to accomplish here today. The phrases abomination of desolation and abomination that maketh desolate are found in both the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, it's found in Daniel 11:31. It says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So that's where the term actually originated, was Daniel 11:31. Just a few verses later in Daniel 12 verse 11 it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." So there's mention of it again in Daniel's important prophecies that he gave to us back there in the Old Testament. So then we come to Matthew 24. What I think is one of the most amazing chapters in all of the Bible, and so very important because Jesus himself is prophesying about the future, isn't he? His disciples ask him, tell us about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world. Kind of two different subjects, but not altogether different, because they do parallel one another. They do have significance upon one another. But Jesus himself prophesying about this abomination says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So he knew where it was at, right, in those important prophecies. It says, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. And then he gives us instructions for what we're to do when we see that come about. All right? The sister verse to this would be in Mark 13:14. It's worded differently. It says, but when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. Where did Jesus say in Matthew? In the holy place. So what do we discover from all of that?
Sounds like a church.
Yeah, it does sound like a church, but it makes us know that when this abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place, it ought not to. Right? So, where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, again, then let them that be in Judea flee into the mountains, and it goes on from there to give us the instruction that he wanted to give us. And so, both Daniel and the Gospels tell us about this. Jesus really tells us about this abomination of desolation. So, in the Old Testament, the word abomination is the Hebrew word 8251. And over here is the way you say it. We've struggled with that a little bit today. It's shikuts. And the meaning for shikuts is disgusting. That is filthy. Especially idolatrous, or concretely an idol. Abominable, filth, idol, detestable thing. Now that's kind of like, putting it bluntly, as many ways as I can think of to put it bluntly. Right? It just keeps building on the same thing. But you see what it says. Disgusting, filth. But what is it in God's eyes that's disgusting and filthy?
Especially
idols. Idolatry. That is the detestable thing. And then if you look at the Greek in the New Testament, it is the word bidel ugma, a detestation, that is specifically idolatry and abomination. It's a shorter definition this time, but is it any different? No. I mean, it's identical, isn't it? And I like that because Jesus is quoting the Old Testament. That ties the Old and the New together. Amen? And puts Jesus' stamp of approval on it personally. And then when you look up the definition of the word used there and the word used here, it's exactly the same, isn't it? So both of these meanings apply to idolatry. But what kind of idolatry is being spoken of here? And for this, we need to look at some of the other Bible verses where this same word, abomination, is used. In 1 Kings 11, starting with verse 5, it says, for Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And then in verse 7 it says, then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. Now, it's important for us to realize in all of this stuff, because we've studied this stuff before, there's really no difference in all these false gods. when it says the God of this people and the God of that people, it's really the gods that they're talking about, the pagan gods and goddesses are all tied together, aren't they? Except for the fact that they've gone to a different place, a different culture, a different language. And that's what we talked about, remember, in our studies. It all starts with Satan. It all starts with Babylon, right? And it comes down through the years, and it gets different names, it gets different stories sometimes, but it's all basically the same false god. It's the same system of worship, isn't it? You know, Ellen White states that God's chosen people today are considered to be His modern Israel. As such, we can pose the question, is there any significance of these gods that Solomon worshipped to God's modern Israel of today, His Seventh-day Adventist people? To find the answer, let us look at these false gods and what they stood for. And I'm just taking little bits and pieces because we're not looking for big ideas here. We're just looking for identification. But in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 487, it says, being especially devoted to Ashtoreth. Who is Ashtoreth? The goddess of the moon. So the goddess Ashtoreth symbolizes the moon. In Amos 5:26, it talks about Moloch and Chiun, your images. And what does it say? Ye have borne the tabernacle of Moloch and Chiun, your images, the star of your God, which ye made unto yourselves, or to yourselves. Now, this is interesting. Amos 5:26 says that the Hebrew people, because Amos was a Hebrew prophet, right? He was delivering a message from God to the Hebrews, and he says, the star of your God. Does God have a star? Our God, does God have a star? Now, I know the Bible says that the stars sang, and we know that's supposed to be angels and that kind of stuff. But did God literally have a star? No.
No, that's astronomy, isn't it?
But it's interesting. Do the Jewish people have a star? Are they connected to a star?
Yes.
Star of David.
The Star of David, they call it. But guess what? It is not the Star of David. It's the star of their God, which they made to themselves. Isn't that what the Bible says? Interestingly enough, there's another Bible verse in the New Testament, Acts 7:43. Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch. Right? We know who Moloch is. We've studied about Moloch. What's Moloch famous for?
Child sacrifice.
Child sacrifice. Burning the children. Okay? You took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your God, but this time it names the God. Remphan, figures which you made to worship them. Right? What is idol worship? Idols when a man makes a thing and with his own hands and then bows down and worships it like it was a god. He says, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Now that's interesting. What was their punishment for worshiping the gods of Babylon?
They got to go to Babylon.
Beyond Babylon.
Isn't that interesting?
He gives them the desires of your heart.
The plagues in Egypt, what were they all about?
The gods.
The false gods, weren't they? And so the 7 last plagues in the book of Revelation, do you think they have something to do with the false worship, the false gods? Well, look at this. I will carry you away beyond Babylon. The god Milcom or Molech symbolizes a star. We know that the earliest idolatry and false worship involved the sun, the moon, and the stars. But this star is also the so-called Star of David, isn't it? That the Israelites adopted as their national symbol. Where did they get this star? It was the star of your god, Remphan, wasn't it? So, did it already exist before the Israelites? Sure it did, just like all the other paganism that we talk about. So this star isn't just any star. It is not the Star of David. It is the star of their God, and he was called Remphan, according to the Bible. And they chose that God over Jehovah, didn't they? And that brings us to the so-called God named Chemosh. This was the god of the sun. Chemosh. The first line up there is from the Strong's Concordance. It says, meaning to subdue, the god of the Moabites. And that's what the Bible, that information just comes from the Bible. This part down here is from the Brown Driver Briggs Bible Dictionary. So there you are. These so-called gods were representative of the sun, moon, and the stars. It says that it's also identified with Baal, Peor, Baal, Zebub, Mars, and Saturn. That line right there from a dictionary really says a lot, doesn't it, about what we've studied in the past about these false gods? It ties it in with Baal, which is the ancient Phoenician sun god. That ties it with the sun worship. But what else? It's putting it to the Greek terms for these gods as well, Mars and Saturn. Second, it says worship of this god was introduced by Solomon. We read that a minute ago, didn't we? And abolished by King Josiah of Judah. You remember who that one was?
He was a hidden child.
He was the one that took over when he was only 8 years old. And I know he didn't do this stuff when he was 8 years old, but that's what he's famous for, right?
He was hidden.
And it seems that I remember he was there for like 30 or some odd years like that. These so-called gods were representative of the sun, moon, and stars. In ancient times, the sun represented Nimrod. The moon represented Semiramis, really vice versa, his wife. And the star represented Tammuz, her son. That was the pagan trinity that we've talked about so many times here. These three symbols also represented the worship of Baal. The priest of Baal would sacrifice to all three, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Look at this. Testimonies, Volume 3, page 263. He pleaded with God to withhold from his ungrateful people dew and rain, the treasures of heaven, that apostate Israel might look in vain to their gods, their idols of gold, wood, and stone, the sun, moon, and stars, to water and enrich the earth and cause it to bring forth plentifully. Who's that talking about?
Elijah.
It's talking about Elijah, the story of Elijah. That's right. Here's another one. Deuteronomy 4:19 says, unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of them, shouldest be driven to worship them and serve them, lest thou look up thine eyes and see these things and be driven to worship them and serve them. Did God know that this was a possibility, a problem? Sure. But he says, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. You know, the sun and the moon, and without knowing why, I already know that the stars were all given to us as a blessing. They're all made by God, and they're all there for a purpose. I don't know what necessarily the star's purpose is, but the sun we couldn't live without. The moon handles things for us like the tides, right? It's God's appointed way.
It's our nightlight.
It's our nightlight too, that's right. But it's God's appointed way to bless us. But we take the thing that God made and we worship it and we leave God out, right? Doesn't make sense. Look at this. Deuteronomy, it's actually going to be verses 2 through 5. Deuteronomy 17, verses 2 through 5. If there be found among you within any of thy gates which the Lord thy God hath given thee, man or woman, that hath wrought wickedness in the sight of the Lord thy God in transgressing his covenant. Now you say, if a man gets caught and he's done wickedness, he gets caught and he's brought in and he's done wickedness. And you think, what kind of wickedness? Well, I think about this. You know, we were so afraid that this woman down here had been abducted, right? And they're saying that maybe that wasn't the case now. But everybody was in fear, thinking that there's somebody running around that's taking people. We think about murders, and we think about rapes, and we think about child molesters, and all this manner of stuff. But when God says, you found a person that's so wicked in the sight of the Lord thy God, what's he talking about? Verse 3 says, and hath gone and served other gods and worshipped them. And then he gets specific. He says, either the sun or moon or any of the host of heaven, which I have not commanded. He did not command us to worship the sun, right? He did not command us to worship the moon. He did not command us to worship any star, not the star of Remphan or anybody else. But look at the language there, which I have not commanded. God has specifically commanded us not to worship all of these idols, the idolatry, and specifically the sun, moon, and stars, right? He mentions it right here. Well, verse 4 says, and it be told thee, and thou hast heard of it, and inquired diligently, and behold, it be true, and the thing certain, that such abomination is wrought in Israel. What are they going to do? Then shalt thou bring forth that man or that woman which have committed that wicked thing unto thy gates, even that man or that woman, and thou shalt, what? Stone them with stones till they die. Is it serious what we're talking about? Israel had been warned not to worship idols. Specifically, the sun, moon, and the stars. Why did God name those three specifically? I mean, there's 1,000 other things that people worship, right?
They were prevalent. They were universal.
They were prevalent and they were universal. It seems like the sun, moon, and the stars was behind every other kind of false worship that there was, right? But they refused to listen, and they joined themselves to Baal. Well, Judges 10 verse 6 says, the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and served Balaam and Ashtoreth, and the gods of Syria, and the gods of Zidon. And remember, it was the god of the Zidonians that we started with, right? So, and the gods of Moab, the gods of the children of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines, and forsook the Lord, and served not him. If you're serving these other gods, can you serve them and God too?
No.
Doesn't work that way. If you're out there doing the false worship, then whatever you're doing with the true God, even if you are trying to keep a foot in both camps, doesn't count, does it? The Bible's very plain about that. Verse 10 of that same chapter says, the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, saying, we have sinned against thee, both because we have forsaken our God, and because we have served Balaam. So you see, there's two aspects to this. It's what they were doing wrong, and it's what they were not doing that would have been right. Think about that. Isn't that always the way it is? And isn't that always the way that it will be? Like, think about it. The people that receive the mark of the beast, are they going to be keeping the Sabbath too? No. So it's an either-or situation, isn't it? Either we're serving this side or we're serving that side. There's no middle ground, is there? Look at this from Great Controversy, page 583. The God of many professedly wise men, of philosophers, poets, politicians, journalists, the God of polished, fashionable circles, of many colleges and universities, even of some theological institutions. Now that's a mouthful, but look what it says. Is little better than Baal worship. It's little better than Baal, the sun god of Phoenicia. Sun worship has been around since the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, right? The main day to worship the sun is Sunday. Although all 7 days of the week are named after a god, aren't they? But the main day to worship the sun is Sunday, or Baal's day, the day of the sun, or the venerable day of the sun, as Constantine put it. Solomon was the wisest king that has ever lived on the earth up to Christ. And yet he fell into this idolatry. So the question we need to ask is, how did he fall into the idolatry, and under what circumstances? Because can we fall into the same idolatry today? Look at this. It's kind of a lengthy quote, but it's from Patriarchs and Prophets, because we need to understand the setup here. We need to understand the story about what was happening back then. She says, while Solomon exalted the law of heaven, God was with him, and wisdom was given him to rule over Israel with impartiality and mercy. But after a morning of great promise, his life was darkened by apostasy. He who had led others to ascribe honor to the God of Israel turned from the worship of Jehovah to bow before the idols of the heathen. Where did the worship of Ashtoreth start? The highest seat in the land, right? Solomon brought it in to the people. All right? In seeking to strengthen his relations with the powerful kingdom lying to the southward of Israel, which was Egypt, Solomon ventured upon forbidden ground. But in forming an alliance with a heathen nation, Solomon rashly disregarded the wise provision that God had made for maintaining the purity of his people. Solomon had begun to lose sight of the source of his power and glory. And you'll notice a capital S there. As inclination gained the ascendancy over reason, self-confidence increased, and he sought to carry out the Lord's purpose in his own way. And I think we need to pause there and say, how many Bible stories are there like that? You know, Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of a big nation. Okay, what can we do to make this happen? We'll go get the second wife, right? You know, it seems like this is human nature. We do this. God gives us a promise, and we try to fulfill God's promises through our own strength and wisdom. Solomon had begun to lose sight of the source of his power and glory as inclination gained the ascendancy over reason. Self-confidence increased, and he sought to carry out the Lord's purpose in his own way. He entered into unholy alliance with nation after nation. the commands of Jehovah were set aside for the customs of surrounding peoples. Now that's starting to tell us something, isn't it? What is the real problem here? So gradual was Solomon's apostasy that before he was aware of it, he had wandered far from God. Almost imperceptibly, he began to put confidence in his own strength. Little by little, he withheld from God that unswerving obedience which was to make Israel a peculiar people. And he conformed more and more closely to the customs of the surrounding nations. The money which should have been held in sacred trust for the benefit of the worthy poor and for the extension of principles of holy living throughout the world, that sounds like church work, right? The religious work. That money was selfishly absorbed in ambitious projects. The king overlooked the need of acquiring the beauty and perfection of character. And again, that's what it's all about. Done the right way. Character building is what it's all about, right?
But he's the wise. He's supposed to be the wise man.
That's exactly right. But it's another one of those situations when you were little in your own eyes. And I know he said this about Saul, but he essentially said the same thing about Solomon. When you were small in your own eyes, then you were great. And you know, he promised Solomon that I'll give you anything you ask for. Now, to make a promise like that, God had to have great confidence in Solomon. And he rightly so, because Solomon said, well, you want me to be a ruler over the people, and so there's no way I can do that in my own strength. Please give me the wisdom I need to do what you want me to do, what you asked me to do. That's awesome, isn't it?
Yeah. And he did.
And he did just exactly.
As long as he stayed connected with God, he got that wisdom, but then he got stupid.
He did exactly what he asked for and what God suggested to him. But then, you know, they wanted to have a king like the rest of the nations around him. You know what that really says? What it really says is because the nations around them, they set up their kings and worship them as gods. So if I'm saying I want to have a king like the other nations, what am I saying?
I don't want you as my God.
I don't want you as my God. I want to have a God that I can see, that I can touch, right?
Right.
I mean,
More like me.
it's so bad. It's so pitiful. All right. More and more the king came to regard luxury, self-indulgence, and the favor of the world as indications of greatness. Think about his father David. The worst sin that he committed, among many, but the worst sin that he committed was to think that the king was above the law. Well, why would you think that the king is above the law?
Because people tell you.
I'm going to tell you why you would think the king is above the law, because the king is a god.
Okay.
And whether they said that out loud, they treated him that way, just like the nations around them. And so you have the same problems as the nations around. All right. Beautiful and attractive women were brought from Egypt, Phoenicia, Edom, Moab, and many other places. Their religion was idol worship. His wives exerted a strong influence over him and gradually prevailed on him to unite with them in their worship. Now I'm just going to tell you, when you say 700 wives and 300 concubines, am I remembering correctly? That is not somebody that has messed up like Jacob and has 2 wives. That's not the same thing. This is somebody that's being worshipped as a god, and he's put himself up that he don't have to pay attention to nothing. I'm sorry, that's the way I see it. So it says Solomon had disregarded the instruction that God had given to serve as a barrier against apostasy. And now he gave himself up to the worship of false gods. Are we learning something about the process?
God told him to leave all them women alone.
That's right. But you see, we're learning something about the process. How did this happen to the wisest king that ever lived before Jesus? And could it happen to us?
Yes.
Absolutely.
You know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church appointed a king. They were told not to. They were told God didn't want a king over the church, but they appointed one anyway. Isn't that right? So, can it happen to us?
It does.
It's really obvious, isn't it, the answer? Solomon's course brought its sure penalty. His separation from God through communication with idolaters was his ruin. Did you get that? His separation from God through communication with idolaters was his ruin. As he cast off his allegiance to God, he lost the mastery of himself. His moral efficiency was gone. He mistook license for liberty. He tried, but at what cost, to unite light with darkness, good with evil, purity with impurity, Christ with Belial. You know, Christ with Antichrist, that's as vast of a difference as you can make, isn't it? And it says God can do little for men who lose their sense of dependence upon Him. How did Solomon try to put good with evil and purity with impurity and Christ with Belial, Satan? It was by making confederations with idolaters,
With the other countries.
with the other nations around him.
That's how he got a lot of his wives.
And that's,
They
yeah.
would send his wives.
Oh, they would be gifts.
Right.
They would be gifts. But he should have been smart enough to turn down the first gift. During these years of apostasy, the spiritual decline of Israel progressed steadily. We only go as high as our leaders. Right? Well, what happens when our church king goes awry? What happens to our church? I mean, that's what this is a picture of. How could it be otherwise when their king had united his interests with satanic agencies? Who was giving Solomon women?
Satan.
It wasn't Phoenicia. It wasn't Egypt. Right? I mean, it was Satan that was doing this stuff. How could it be otherwise when their king had united his interests with satanic agencies? Through these agencies, the enemy worked to confuse the mind of the Israelites in regard to true and false worship. And they became an easy prey. It's all about worship, isn't it? What is the book of Revelation about?
Worship.
It's all about worship. Not only who we are going to worship, but how we're going to worship. Right? Refusing to follow the path of obedience, they transferred their allegiance to the enemy of righteousness. The Israelites rapidly lost their abhorrence of idol worship. The more we see sin, and we don't call it by its right name, what happens? We get comfortable with it, don't we? There is a lesson for us in the history of Solomon, okay? Do we need a lesson from this? She's already answered that question. He might have gone from strength to strength, from character to character, ever approaching nearer the similitude of the character of God. But how sad his history. He was exalted to most sacred positions of trust, but he proved unfaithful. Association with idolaters corrupted his faith. One false step led to another. There was a breaking down of the barriers which God had erected for the safety of His people. His life was corrupted, and at last He gave Himself to the worship of false gods. Now look at this. Oh, how can God bear with the misdeeds of those who have had great light and advantages, and yet follow the course of their own choosing to their eternal harm? Oh, how can God bear with these? Well, she's talking about Solomon. It says Solomon chose his own way, and in his heart separated from God. Solomon dishonored himself, dishonored Israel, and dishonored God. But how many of you are reading this and thinking about now, about our own church, our own nation, our own lives? Looking upon this picture, we see what human beings become when they venture to separate from God. One false step prepares the way for another, and every step is taken more easily than the last. Thus souls are found following another leader than Christ. And one of my old songs, and I've quoted this so many times, but one of my old songs says that sin will take you farther than you intended to go. Sin will leave you longer than you intended to stay. And sin will cost you far more than what you intended to pay. Now, this is a different quote. All who occupy positions in our institutions will be tested. If they will make Christ their pattern, He will give them wisdom and knowledge and understanding. They will grow in grace and aptitude in Christ's way. Their characters will be molded after His similitude. If they fail of keeping the way of the Lord, another spirit will control the mind and judgment. And they will plan without the Lord and take their own course and leave the positions they have occupied. The light has been given them. If they depart from it, let no man present a bribe to induce them to remain. They will be a hindrance and a snare.
Wow.
That's some pretty heavy words, isn't it? All right. Let the sad memory of Solomon's apostasy warn every soul to shun the same precipice. You know what a precipice is?
Cliff.
Yeah, it could be like a cliff where you're going to fall off. All right? His weakness and sin are handed down from generation to generation. Folks, God has warned that all in Seventh-day Adventist institutions in position of authority are to be tested and proved. And that the same weaknesses and sins of Solomon's apostasy are handed down to all. Actually, folks, it's worse. We're living after many thousands more years of degradation, right? What would happen if the Seventh-day Adventist Church leadership would prove to be unfaithful and follow the apostasy of Solomon? The candlestick was removed out of its place when Solomon forgot God. When Solomon was doing all this stuff, was he saved? Was he once saved and always saved? Not at all. He lost the light of God. He lost the wisdom of God. He confounded idolatry with religion. That word confounded means he confused idolatry with religion. I think that's interesting because what's it all about in the last days? Come out of Babylon. What does Babylon mean?
Confusion.
Confusion. As we have discovered, the host of heaven were worshipped by Solomon and Israel, which constituted Baal worship. Right? Because whatever of these lesser gods that you worship, it's really all part of the system that is Baal worship. The main symbol in Baal worship is the sun, and the day to worship the sun is Sunday, Baal's day. Keeping all of that in mind. We've also discovered that the word abomination in Daniel and Matthew and Mark means disgusting, filthy Baal worship. It means Baal worship, doesn't it? Sunday worship. Now let's look at the meaning of the words desolate and desolation. Actually, I didn't copy those down. But what were Jesus' words to his true followers? He said, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place," then you're supposed to do something, right? That was the great sign that was to be made. From history, we know that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And we talk about that figure all the time. But guess what? The abomination of desolation occurred in 66 AD. The Roman army under command of General Cestius surrounded Jerusalem in AD 66. But just before it fell, he unexpectedly withdrew his forces, and while retreating, he planted the abomination of desolation. Do you know what that is?
They're symbols.
Their flag, their symbol. That's exactly right. Their banner. The banner of Rome in the holy ground. About 3 years later, another Roman general named Titus resumed the assault, keeping up the siege until Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, in AD 70. But you know what? When he came back in 70 AD, there was no hope for the people. There was nothing they could do to escape. So, there was absolutely no excuse for any of Christ's followers to lose their lives when Jerusalem was destroyed. They had had 3 years of time, and they were given a perfect symbol. And praise the Lord, it's one of the few happy times in history as far as Christians are concerned, because Ellen White says not one Christian lost his life in the siege of Jerusalem, right? The destruction of Jerusalem.
But they had to walk away from their homes and possessions.
Absolutely did. It says here, the only people who did lose their lives were those who chose not to follow Christ's warnings, but remained within Jerusalem. You know, think about it. What Ron just said. You're going to lose your stuff. You're going to lose your house. You're going to lose your businesses.
Lot's wife.
Yeah, it's so much like the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, and especially his wife. It also says it was only the mercy of God that Jerusalem was not destroyed sooner. They were there, they were ready to do the job, and then for some mysterious reason they backed off. Christ's warnings were extremely important, vital, life-depending, right? To his true followers back then. But can the words of Jesus be just as life-depending, important today?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And here's a question. Will the abomination that follows occur again in our time?
Yeah.
When we study about the abomination that maketh desolate in the spirit of prophecy, it says that all of this is going to happen again. It does have a bearing on those of us that are living in the last days. Christ presented before them an outline of the prominent events to transpire before the close of time. His words were not then fully understood, but their meaning was to be unfolded as his people should need the instruction therein given. The prophecy which he uttered was twofold in its meaning. While foreshadowing the destruction of Jerusalem, it prefigured also the terrors of the last days. So when Jesus is talking to his disciples in Mark 13 and Matthew 24, and he makes these prophecies, they had asked him two questions that really didn't go together. But he answered those two questions as one answer, the way that he answered it. And thus taught that those two things were going to apply to one another in the last days. They do have bearing upon those of us who are living in the last days. Jesus declared to the listening disciples the judgments that were to fall upon apostate Israel, and especially the retributive vengeance that would come upon them for their rejection and crucifixion of the Messiah. Unmistakable signs would precede the awful climax. The dreaded hour would come suddenly and swiftly, when the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up in the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls. Then the followers of Christ were to find safety in flight. Now this is the very first page of the Great Controversy. Okay? That's where you find that information. But look at what it says here. When the warning sign should be seen, judgment was to follow so quickly that those who would escape must make no delay. Throughout the land of Judea, as well as in Jerusalem itself, the signal for flight must be immediately obeyed. They must not hesitate a moment, lest they be involved in the general destruction. Many scholars believe that the standard or banner of Rome, which was set up in the holy ground of Jerusalem, was a lion-faced sun. In other words, a lion, its mane pictured as the alternating sun rays. So the sign for flight was when the idolatrous standard of Rome, the banner of the sun, was set up or exalted in the holy place of Jerusalem. And notice it wasn't just being inside Jerusalem, it said some furlongs outside the walls of the city. That's amazing. The banner of Roman Catholicism is undoubtedly the day of the sun. Sunday worship. What would be the abomination of desolation today? Wouldn't it be Sunday worship? And we recognize it as the mark of the beast. But this is another way to look at it. Jerusalem is a representation of what the church will be if it refuses to walk in the light that God has given. By rejecting God's warning in this our day, men are repeating the sin of Jerusalem. And we know that this has happened to most of the churches in our land. But what about our own church? What about the Seventh-day Adventist Church? If the Seventh-day Adventist Church repeats the same sins of Solomon by disregarding the warnings and counsels of God, then they also confound or confuse idolatry with religion. And don't you remember from studying the Old Testament that that's what God hates more than anything? Even in the New Testament, He says, I would rather you be hot or cold. But don't try to mix the two, because that's what lukewarm is. It's mixture of cold and hot. And where these sins and this idolatry is concerned, it's mixing the false religion with the true religion. And that's the thing that God hates the worst. Folks, could the Seventh-day Adventist Church fall just like Jerusalem did? If they will continue to disregard the reproofs he sends them and act contrary to his declared will, ruin must follow. The wages of sin is death, right? You don't get good fruit from a bad tree. I mean, there's all these biblical concepts that we've been taught. For God's people are kept in prosperity only by his mercy, through the care of his messengers. He will not uphold and guard a people who disregard his counsels and despise his reproofs. The Lord has declared that the history of the past shall be rehearsed as we enter upon the closing work. It's going to come back, isn't it? The thing that has already been is the thing that will be. A serious question must be asked. Is the Seventh-day Adventist Church following Christ and his teachings, or are they rejecting the truth and following the same path as did Solomon and Jerusalem? The path to ruin and destruction. The path of idolatry. The only way to answer this question would be to examine the history